Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture on Afro-Latinidades. Now, the term Afro-Latino is one that has arisen in the last few years to talk about Latinos who identify as having Black ancestry, and also a way to recognize and talk about the fact that there is Blackness within Latinx population, and also to be able to have conversations and dialogues around the anti-Blackness that exists within Latinx communities. So Afro-Latinos refers to Latinos of African ancestry, people who choose Blackness as a racial identity, and also identify along ethnic lines with their Latinx national origin. It also includes, as we saw in one of the readings, people who are mixed race for both, who might be like half Latino and half African American, such as the author Maria Rosario Jackson, who talked about her experience being Mexican and African American. The reading mentioned Arturo Alfonso Schomburg as a important Afro-Latino figure in history, in Latinx history in the US, who himself was Afro-Puerto Rican, but also dedicated his life to create a collection of writings, artwork, books, manuscripts, and so on by African peoples throughout the world. So he was an Afro-Puerto Rican migrant who was born in 1974 and migrated to New York City in 1891. When he arrives to New York, he becomes involved in the revolutionary independence movement that was organizing within New York City for independence for Puerto Rico and Cuba from the Spanish at that time. He was co-founder of one of these organizations called Las Dos Antillas in 1892. After the Spanish-American War takes place, where the U.S. takes over Puerto Rico and Cuba, many of these activists are kind of at a loss because they're not quite sure what to do next, as they're in this moment of trying to see what's going to happen after the war and how the United States is going to treat these islands. So he turns instead to his Afro-American interests and actually becomes involved with the African-American community in New York City at that time. When he was a young child in Puerto Rico, he asked one of his teachers what history Black people had, and where did Black people fit into world history. And his teacher's response was that Black people had no history. And so this seed was planted by this teacher at a very young age, so much, and stays there so much so that when he becomes an adult and his involvement in the independence movement at the time wanes, he decides to dedicate himself to, in essence, prove that teacher wrong. And he spends most of his income traveling, purchasing books, manuscripts, artwork by and about the African diaspora. This collection is eventually sold in 1926 to the New York Public Library, becoming what is today the Schomburg Center. And here in this image, what we see is an actual picture book that's been written about him and his collection of and the different kinds of things that he found. And what we've seen more recently is a lot more picture books coming out that are focusing on historical figures such as himself. One of the readings talked about how the Afro-Latino experience is different from other Latinx populations. They experience, for one, discrimination from fellow Latinos. They're perceived as outsiders from the Latinx identity. The reading gave a number of examples of people who are Afro-Latino who are questioned by other Latinos about whether they're really Latinos or not. So they're perceived as outsiders from this identity. Black Latinxes, according to studies, have lower incomes, higher unemployment, less education, and live in segregated neighborhoods compared to not only the rest of the American population, but also in comparison to other Latino populations. This community is usually resistant to the Latino-Hispanic category becoming a racial category. As the reading discussed, the possibility of having Latino-Hispanic becoming a racial category feels, again, like another moment of invisibilizing their particular experiences if they're just all lumped together into one category. They also challenge the idea of mestizaje, as we talked about last time. Mestizaje has been an idea that's been used to sort of talk about the Latin American population and its mixed race background, but it's also been used to sort of create this idealistic notion that there are no racial differences in Latin America, there's no racism among Latinos, and so Afro-Latinos really sort of challenge this idea of mestizaje. The reading also talked about historical tensions between the Latinx and African American populations in the United States, and how this tension sort of manifests itself as well within the population, within the Latino population, in tensions with the Afro-Latino population itself. These two populations perceive each other as sources of economic, political, and social competition, where they are often pinned against each other for competition over jobs, over who has more political power in any particular place, and also who's more socially accepted or not within the mainstream culture. The reading also talked about this idea of racial bribe, the idea that assimilation into whiteness is available for light-skinned Latinxes, but this bribe requires the Latinxes keep their distance from Blackness, right? Now, in recent years, with the Black Lives Matter movement, it's become more visible, this experience of Afro-Latinos and how they feel rejected within the Latino community, and have been more vocal about the anti-Blackness within the Latino community. And this has led to many within the Latino population to be more open about their support and solidarity with not just the African-American community, but with Blackness in general. So some signs of improvement that we've seen in recent years have been the participation by Latinxes in Black Lives Matter protests. One of the readings talked about there being more visibility in the media of Afro-Latinos and an increase in Black Latinx solidarity organizing. But this doesn't mean that everybody has sort of gotten over the hurdle. As we've seen more recently, there was the incident with the Latina councilwoman from Los Angeles who resigned after a leaked recording of her racist comments, particularly anti-Black comments and comments against the African-American community during a conversation on gentrification. And I've included a video that talks a little bit about that incident and sort of its impact on this issue of Latinos and Blackness. The readings also sort of talked about the term itself of Afro-Latino and when the term is used, who chooses to use it or not. And so some of the points that were discussed in the reading included using categories or labels in strategic ways. This was discussed in the reading by the African-American, Mexican-American woman, where she talks about her relationship with the term Afro-Latino, when she uses it or not, and talks about categories and racial ethnic labels and how she uses them or sees them as using them in strategic ways. One of the other readings talked about Afro-Latino as a term that still negates Blackness. And that reading, the author talked about how she has observed how Afro-Latino is used to create a separate and unequal Blackness, where Afro-Latinos use the term to still distinguish themselves from African Americans. It's sort of a different kind of Blackness. And she talked about alternative terms to Afro-Latinx, such as Black Latinx or Afrodescendiente. So she was very adamant about how for her, using a term like Afro-Latino should be about specifically recognizing their Blackness and their history as Black people in the Americas. And these two quotes from two of the different articles, I think, encapsulates this idea of the term Afro-Latino being used differently depending on who you talk to, and it just adds to our previous earlier conversation about ethnic labels for the Latinx population and how these labels change over time, and what they mean for individuals isn't all the same for everybody, right? So in the first quote, Maria Rosario Jackson states, "I'm okay with the Afro-Latino label, which is coming into vogue, but if someone asks, I say I am African-American and Mexican. And in the American context, I tend to say Black or African-American first because that has been my most significant formative experience. But it is contextual and depends sometimes on who's asking and why." So you really see in her experience, the question as to how she identifies, the answer is, well, it depends, really. And in the second quote, Janelle Martinez states, "Identity isn't clear-cut, it's complex and multi-layered. As I journey through life, just as my current experiences influence how I identify, new encounters and knowledge will further shape it. No matter which term I use, my pride in my African roots will forever be a constant." So she's clear in affirming, right, her pride in her African roots, but what that is called, what label gets used to affirm that pride may change over time, and changes as she expresses based on what experience she's having, what new knowledge she gains, and so on. So that ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to your comments online. Have a good week.